One of the most interesting and certainly most controversial subjects to hit New York City in recent years is the development of mid-Manhattan's West Side. Whether it's the perfect place for a new stadium for the Jets and the Olympics, or an opportunity to expand the Jacob Javits Center, or the right time and place for a massive new residential and commercial development, the ideas are flowing, the real estate developers are circling, and the politicians are trying valiantly to steer the development toward their own priorities. I'm Sarah Bartlett, and this is our topic today on USA Inc. Joining me as co-host of today's show is Doug Musio, a Baruch professor who hosts his own show on CUNY TV, City Talk, and is also a political analyst for WABC TV. Our guest today is Charles Lauster, the director of the Pergolis Urban Gallery at Baruch College's Newman Real Estate Institute, who is also the president of his own architectural firm. Thank you both for being on the show today.
My pleasure.
I thought we'd start out if you could just tell us a little bit about the exhibit that currently is in the gallery and what that says about the debate going on in Manhattan.
We call the exhibit Alternative Visions, what the far west side could be if ... It is a collection of the alternative ideas for how you could plan the evolution of the West Side. The Municipal Art Society, the Regional Plan Association, the Hell's Kitchen Neighborhood Association have all contributed their ideas to the show. The bulk of the show, however, is the Newman proposal, which looks at it from a somewhat different point of view.
Can you tell us a little bit about the specifics of the Newman proposal?
We came to understand after a 2-year study of the West Side that the real problem over there, the thing that was causing most of the distortions in planning, was the convention center. It's somewhat accidental that the convention center wound up there originally. And since then, it has blocked 5 blocks of waterfront from the Hell's Kitchen neighborhood. The expansion of the convention center will be another 2 blocks, a total of 7 blocks of waterfront cut off from the city, and totally cutting Hell's Kitchen off. Because it's there, the city then confronted the problem of where is the next large amount of commercial office space going to be built. The 1982 plan for expansion to 8th Avenue was complete. It was a big success. Where do they go next? So they looked at this area, which is vastly underutilized. But the convention center was sitting in this prime spot. So the city said, oh my God, we're going to have to go up north-south next to it. Now, the convention center, when it was built, they said it would be responsible for all this development over there. Well, if you stand in front of the convention center and put your back to the convention center and look east across 11th Avenue, there's not even a hot dog stand. There's nothing. So in 20 years, they have encouraged the development of nothing. So the city now says, all right, we'll put upwards of 25 million square feet of commercial space over 30 years along that corridor. It's not connected to any other central business district. It's just out there. No one would ever start out saying, let's do it that way. But they were stuck because the convention center was there. And then into the mix you get the stadium. Now there's lots and lots of excitement about the stadium. But the stadium is really yet the third player who came in a kind of uncoordinated manner, saying, we'd like to be there. And really what was to stop them? There was no real planning for that area anyway. So that whole open cut of the rail yards, which go from 12th Avenue to 9th Avenue, that the trains come in, which is totally open to the sky but unused, was just sitting there.
So what's the essence of the Newman proposal then?
The Newman proposal said if the convention center is the problem, move the convention center.
This is the flip?
We call it the flip. We take the convention center, which is next to the river, and we pick it up in effect, and we put it down over the railroad yards.
But you don't just pick it up, you have to knock it down.
What happens is we build a new convention center using the old convention center up until the day the new one's done. Then you turn off the lights in the old convention center and move over to the new one and take it down. Once you take the convention center down, you have property that's already owned by the state. It's public property. that this can now be used for housing, that the Hell's Kitchen neighborhood can now move all the way to the river. The value of that property under the convention center has been valued by Robert Van Anken of Grubb & Ellis, probably the best appraisers in the city, at $3 billion. So that's $3 billion worth of value that can be unleashed.
Let me ask a prior question. What are we talking about when we talk about the Hudson Yards, the far west midtown? Lay out the geography of the general area and then locate your plan within that geography. What are we talking about for us New Yorkers?
This is the land along the west side of Manhattan between 42nd Street and 30th Street, okay? Now, that had been, it's right on the Hudson River, it had been a vital seaport, been a major dock area. And it had, the inland of that, the neighborhood there, Hell's Kitchen, was basically a community of dock workers and people associated with working on the docks. So it was a good, hard-working, working class community. Over the course of the 20th century, a lot of horrible things happened to it. First, the train around the turn of the century, around 1904, that came through from New Jersey. I mean, huge benefit for New York, but it opened up this tremendous cut. And the cut goes from 12th Avenue to 9th Avenue, from 31st Street to 33rd Street. And that's that big rail yard that you ride over when you go uptown, downtown on 11th or 10th Avenues. That was the first big disruption of the neighborhood. Then around the late 30s was the beginning of the Lincoln Tunnel and all the ramps and things that helped. That completely cut up more of that neighborhood. Then the Port Authority building got built and more chopping up. So that neighborhood has been terribly chopped up, which has made it very hard for that part of Hell's Kitchen to develop in the way that, let's say, today, Clinton, which looks so delightful, north of 42nd Street, they haven't been able to do that because there's so many disruptions.
And this is, what, a 60-block area of ultimately prime New York City real estate?
Yes, it's from 10th Avenue to the river, from 42nd Street to approximately 30th Street. All of this is the area in play right now. And the city has its scheme, and we have ours. Okay.
Everybody agrees that there's a need for more commercial development, real estate development, improved transportation, open space. But this proposal, the city's proposal, with the stadium primarily, has produced intense conflict. In fact, it has emerged as the issue. It's a classic New York City story. Money, real estate, power. It's a framing issue. Why hasn't it been developed in the past? What has prevented it from happening? And what's happening right now? Just talk a bit about the state of the issue right at this very moment.
Well, New York has reached a point that it hasn't seen in certainly my lifetime and many's lifetime. My lifetime's pretty old, so it's been a long time. But New York went through terrible times, starting in the late 50s through the 60s. And the 70s, it got really difficult because money was cut off. The 80s were difficult because it was coming off of that tremendous loss of money and support, the crime. Just a very difficult problem. Beginning in the late 90s, New York is coming back into its own as a real world city. A lot of its problems are solved, and it's growing. It's growing very quickly in population. We're as big as we've ever been in the past, and we're continuing to grow. Nobody's really started thinking about it, but we could be 9 million people. And at 9 million people, we're going to put tremendous stress on infrastructure that we have not invested in for decades because of all these troubles that we've been through. So the good news is the city's in great shape, it's growing, and the bad news is we haven't really taken care of the house, and there's all sorts of leaks, there's problems, and we have to start investing in it. Now, the commercial office space situation has been such that all of the easy places are developed. The East Side is developed, Midtown is developed, they've moved west to 8th Avenue. Where's the next place?
Let me just interrupt briefly. What about downtown, World Trade Center? Doesn't this new development, this new business center, really conflict with the needs and demands of downtown?
Well, downtown has its needs and demands. What they're talking about is essentially replacing what was lost. So absent 9/11, which is hard to think of, but if that hadn't happened, we would still be doing exactly what we're doing on the west side.
What do you think the advantages are from an urban planning standpoint of the kind of proposal that you laid out? Why is that superior to some of the, in your view, to some of these other proposals?
The big advantage is you open up the Hell's Kitchen neighborhood to regular neighborhood expansion. I mean, the highest and best use in New York now, you ask historically what's, it used to be the highest and best use was always commercial, was always the office tower, and not anymore. Now it's housing. This is a remarkably new environment for us to be in. So the idea that you would cramp the development of Hell's Kitchen is crazy. You really want to have it develop as much as possible as a continuous neighborhood.
Especially along the waterfront.
Up to the waterfront. So from the waterfront to 9th Avenue, you'd have a wonderful neighborhood.
Now, the current city proposal with the expansion of the Javits Center and the stadium, as I see it, essentially creates a 12-block wall along the waterfront that's almost impenetrable. You have no views through the river, and the waterfront development, the actual use of the waterfront, seems to be severely circumscribed under the city's plan.
That's absolutely right. It absolutely cuts off the waterfront. But worse, you have the cutoff of the waterfront with these institutional buildings, the convention center and the stadium. Then you have from 10th to 11th, you really have the city's office commercial building corridor, which is plunked down unconnected to the rest of the commercial city. And that is a real danger for Hell's Kitchen, because 8th Avenue is the other side of the commercial zone, and they're going to want to meet.
So it's sort of the end of Hell's Kitchen.
So Hell's Kitchen is a residential neighborhood over 30 years, may cease to exist.
And what about their commercial development? Where would they situate it as opposed to, where would you situate it in your
Well, what we
proposal?
do is we get the same numbers, the same 25 million square feet, by essentially continuing the 34th Street corridor. You've got the Empire State Building, and you have office buildings moving west, and then they sort of stop. But we can say, keep them moving all the way to the river. We're talking about putting the convention center over the tracks, but you can also put these towers on top of the convention center. We can sort of make what Bob Geddes has called a club sandwich. You have retail at grade, you have the convention center floating over the streets, and then you have these towers on top.
And or the possibility of the stadium. I mean, your plan does not necessarily have to include a stadium, but it seems to include the ability to have the stadium on top of the convention center. So you've got the convention center, you've got all this development, you have parkland, and you may have a stadium. Is this engineeringly possible?
Oh,
Let's
absolutely.
save that question for right after this break.
The Zicklin School of Business at Baruch College of the City University of New York is the largest and most diverse accredited business school in the United States, offering high-quality, full-time and part-time degree programs at the undergraduate, master's, and PhD levels. For information about the Zicklin School of Business, please visit our website, zicklin.baruch.cuny.edu. That's zicklin.baruch.cuny.edu.
Welcome back. Doug and I are speaking with Charles Lauster, director of the Pergolis Urban Gallery at Baruch College's Newman Real Estate Institute. We were talking just before we cut off to focus on the structural engineering of this. Is it really physically possible to build all of this on top of the rail yards?
Yes, it is.
How do you know that?
Well, how do we know that? We hired one of the best structural engineers in the city, Severed Associates. Severed Associates has done a lot of work in the area of the rail yards. They know it intimately. But it's not that mysterious. The structure is really conventional. It's really just a lot of steel. It's really a lot of steel. But the proposal for the Jet Stadium is exactly the same. They're using those areas where they can bring the foundations down, and they're propping up the stadium over the tracks. We're doing exactly the same, but if we had the stadium, we'd just be propping it up a little higher. So it's really exactly the same structural strategy. It's just doing it much more extensively. We had to do a structural study like this in great depth so that we could calculate the tonnage of steel needed, because that's the real cost. That's when you want to say, how much does this thing cost? It's really about steel. So we had to know how we structured it so we could figure out the tonnage, so we could figure out the cost.
When I hear the discussion of knocking down the Javits Center, the intensity of the structural requirements, I can only imagine that this is hugely expensive. How can you possibly How can we as a city afford this? Is it just sort of pie in the sky?
Well, actually, it's odd that you asked that, because if you did this, you'd save some money. And you say,
How
does
is that possible?
Oh, this is good.
Right. We've laid this out in incredible detail. We've given the cost of every escalator. The city hasn't done that, so there's a certain
Or if they
mismatch
have, we
here.
haven't shared
Well,
it.
with them, they've done it. We clearly know they've done it, but we haven't seen it.
And we don't know the quality.
But we have seen some numbers. So I think if we compare the numbers we have, we can decide which is the most expensive. The city-state is preparing to expand the convention center for $1.4 billion. Okay, that is an expensive expansion. They're spending that much money because they're actually rebuilding the whole thing, because the column structure is all strange. But that's why they're spending so much money on the expansion. So $1.4 billion. We're building a convention center that's 55% larger in exhibition space, that has 3 times as much meeting room space. Their convention center will be the 8th largest in the country, and the one we're proposing will be the 2nd largest after Chicago, after it expands. We're spending $2.4 billion. Try and hold these numbers together for a minute. But to make theirs work, they need to expand the number 7 line. Now, the number 7 line cost is anywhere from $2.5 to $4 billion. We would love to see the 7 line expanded, but we don't need it. So
Why not?
Because we're not running north-south. We're running along 34th Street, and we're putting in a monorail running from the subways at 7th Avenue to 12th Avenue along 34th Street, but the monorail only costs $550 million. It's a lot cheaper. Now, next, you've got infrastructure. We have our big land bridge. Our big land bridge goes from 12th Avenue to 9th Avenue, and that's the structure for all this supporting. It costs about $1.6 billion. But the city is going to spend $800 million for the jets. That's their infrastructure number that they told us about. So if you add up those 2 columns, the city cost is $4.7 billion, and our cost is $4.55 billion.
Now, obviously, I mean, not being terribly familiar with the numbers, one could argue that the expansion of the 7 line might have derivative benefits that are not factored into your cost analysis. But let's just take it as it is, that there is a reasonable approximation within a couple $100 million, you know, but those monies add up. So it's not an outrageously expensive plan that you're proposing, but just in terms of the practicality, in terms of the ability to sell it to the people who it needs to be sold to, government officials, private sector, how do you sell them on destroying Javits and flipping this around? Is it simply an economic argument?
Well, it's an economic and a practical one and a public policy one. Practically speaking, they're going to practically tear down the existing Javits Center and build a whole new building.
Anyway.
So this isn't really an expansion. It's somewhat misleading. To spend $1.4 billion, you have to do a lot of work.
Okay.
I mean, not to get overly technical, but the Javits Center doesn't work because the columns are on a 45-foot grid. The whole exhibition industry is based on a 30-foot module. So nothing fits in the Javits Center. So they have to do dramatic work. So they're going to knock it down anyway. They're going to leave this little piece up as kind of a memory of the old Javits Center. But they're doing that right now.
Okay.
So we're not doing anything more radical than that.
Okay. One of the sine qua non of all the plans that are out there is an expansion of the Javits Center. Let me devil's advocate. Why do we need an expanded Javits Center? I heard that we're number 32 in convention space. Do we need all this convention space? Isn't it true that there are lots of convention centers that have been built that are operating at far less than capacity? Do we really need an expanded Javits Center in the first place?
I'm not exactly the one to answer that. I mean, there are people who argue this tremendously. There's a lot of data that convention centers don't really generate the kind of numbers that people want. On the other hand, there's the New York exceptional concept where New York is, if you're going to have a convention center anywhere, wouldn't you have one in New York? What we're saying is that the existing convention center is killing that part of the city, so it ought to go away. Now, if you need one, we said, fine, we'll build one over the yards. If you don't need one at all, then don't build one over the yards. But if you need one, that's a great place to build it. So our argument doesn't start from the notion we must have a convention center any more than it starts from the notion that we must have a stadium. What we're saying is we must have some rational, comprehensive planning in that area to get the best residential possibilities and the best commercial possibilities and the best retail possibilities. The other uses, you know, you can plan around.
If this is such a viable concept, both in terms of the money that's involved and in terms of creating a more viable neighborhood. Why hasn't it been embraced? I don't get the sense that people are rushing to your door.
No, they're not. Well, first of all, we're not developers. We're not building this. I mean, this is Baruch College.
And you have no stake in it.
We're not going to build this.
And Baruch hasn't endorsed it.
This is what we're trying to get people to realize is there are planning possibilities here, and nobody's really paying attention to that. So we've given this as an example of the kind of big thinking that you can do that's really commensurate with New York and what it can be.
Yeah, in a sense, this is a paradigm shift. Are we ready for this paradigm shift? And a further question is, given the politics, the recent politics surrounding the Jets Stadium and questions about its viability, has there been interest among the mayoral candidates, for example, or other public officials in your approach?
Well, I can say categorically that the Hell's Kitchen Neighborhood Community Board 4 are very interested in it and have been very supportive in helping us develop it, because their sophistication on this topic is unbelievable. We gained tremendous insight from working with them, and they've been very supportive of what we're trying to do, because after all, this makes for a better neighborhood. So they've been great. I think the civic organizations, Regional Plan, Municipal Art Society, we've all been very collegial and supportive in this. They've said very nice things about what we've been trying to do. But it's breaking through to the public. There is a huge amount of tension about this, and certainly the silence of the development community, pro and con, has been notable.
Can I follow up?
Sure.
With the March 21st bid solicitation by the MTA, do you expect or do you see other developers coming in other than the Jets and Cablevision and actually bidding on this parcel?
I don't really have any first-hand knowledge or any kind of knowledge about what other people are planning. We know that Transgas has made a proposal. I think it's interesting how the Olympics has kind of like complicated every development site in New York that you'd want to think about, and that's a part of that. I wouldn't be shocked if a non-New York development entity came into the market. I mean, there's a lot of concern about vulnerability to problems for locals.
Can you
for
be
people
more
who aren't
specific?
locals,
Right,
they
please.
might come in.
Can you be more specific?
Could I be more precise? I probably could. I'll give it a try.
Would you?
The real estate in New York is a complicated thing, and most developers have projects all over the place. And given how white hot this issue is, and it's so unlike everything else that's going on in the city and the usual extremely civilized nature of the administration, that people do not want to antagonize the government. Because this is one issue, but they have other projects, and they really don't want to create problems for themselves in other areas in such a highly speculative and unclear place, such as what's going on with West Side.
Well, if I may, as the political analyst, if you will, there's a doctor off Bloomberg problem that these developers are afraid of repercussions should they bid, that they have to deal with a deputy mayor who's so inextricably bound to this development in the stadium?
I believe people perceive that, yeah.
And you would say then that non-New Yorkers would be less prone to these pressures?
Well, they're less vulnerable. If you don't have any projects going on in New York at the moment, then what do you care? That you can't be hurt. Administrations come and go. So in the big picture, if you're an out-of-towner and you can operate at this scale, this might be just the time to jump in, because you're not going to have the same sort of competition you'd have with the locals who you would assume have already sewn up the deal. So I don't know of any, but I really wouldn't be shocked, because it seems to me, given the dollar and a lot of other reasons, this might be a very interesting time to work at a very big scale.
What's so interesting about this to me is just the fact that there is this urban planning focus in your show, which I should say is on for another month or two, right? And it's on East 27th? Can you give us
it's the Newman
22nd?
Institute, part of Baruch College, at 137 East 22nd Street.
So the public can go and view this if they want to learn more about it.
And it's a fabulous exhibition. Sarah and I had joined you earlier, and it's well worth seeing.
Thank you.
But I think the issue is it such an anathema to New York City to think that we could have really interesting urban planning going on here? I mean, this is such a vast site, and it cries out for it, and yet it's as if this is an afterthought.
Well, generally, I have to say this about Mayor Bloomberg. Mayor Bloomberg has been great for planning. I mean, there's more good planning going on in the city of New York now than there has been since the urban design group of John Lindsay, in the late 60s. So the mayor has been spectacular for planning. And, you know, you can talk about Greenpoint, Williamsburg, Lower Manhattan, 125th Street. It's just all over the place. And it's been spectacular. Amanda Burton has been terrific. This is one area that seems to be, you know, the mayor's evil brother or something. I mean, it's just, or twin or whatever it's called. It's just like, where does this come from? Nobody really understands it. It's just so intense. It's so unnecessary.
We've been very fortunate to have Charles Lauster, director of the Pergolis Urban Gallery at Baruch College's Newman Real Estate Institute. Thank you, Charles, for being on the show.
Thank you very much.
Some people think of New York as the world's second home. The City University of New York, with students coming from 90 countries and speaking more than 155 languages, is the world's first university. Find us on the web at cuny.edu or call us at 1-800-CUNY-YES.
Here's what I like about the ideas on display at the Pergolis Gallery. They're fresh, they're original, and they illustrate all that can be so exciting about urban planning. So far, most of the debate over the West Side has been conducted under very constrained circumstances. Bloomberg officials made it clear from the get-go that they wanted to deal with the Jets. Their fervor for the Olympics and the dual mission the stadium had to serve scared away potential alternatives and almost cowed the MTA into moving forward without entertaining other proposals. Cablevision's audacious bid, whatever you may think of the company's motives, at least forced the debate over what the MTA should get for that massive tract of land into the open. With all the political wheeling and dealing, how refreshing then to see someone take a blank piece of paper and say, what if? What is the best use of that land? What's the best way to enhance what's already there? What if there were no political constraints? What if one could dream? It may not have political traction. Better minds than mine may fault their scheme on architectural or engineering grounds, but I applaud them for having the courage to think creatively, blinders off, about what might be one of Manhattan's biggest developments in decades. For USA Inc., I'm Sarah Bartlett.